Vicky, thank you very much. And good morning, folks joining us from all over the world, actually. And I think that is the amazing thing with this current sort of technology that we're using, but we've always had. We've just never really thought about using it. So as Vicky said, we're going to be talking about this little concept called Ridgeline Thinking. So my company is called Ridgeline. And when we got to looking to rebrand it a couple of years ago, I was in the midst of something called a 9 Peaks record attempt. And that is to summit the highest points in each of the 9 provinces in South Africa in as fast as possible. And I think it was about 3 o'clock on morning 3 with about 5 hours of sleep since we started. This whole idea of Ridgeline and Ridgeline thinking sort of dawned on me quite literally. And you know what, when you're climbing a mountain, the kind of relatively easiest access to a summit is to find a ridgeline and to follow that up. And once you get onto that ridgeline, that's kind of the first opportunity you have to not only see very often where you still have to go, but you also get to see where you've come from. And I think that is so vitally important, particularly in this kind of fast-moving world that we're living in right now. And I think the faster the world is moving, the more we have to deal with change and disruption, the more we're asking ourselves as boards and as executives in any business, what value do we add? What value do our employees add? And really what constitutes value? So it means we also need to look very carefully at how we measure performance. And what I'm going to do in this presentation this morning is look at some of those concepts that I use not only as a director of 2 companies, but also that we use on mountaineering expeditions, where I take normal people, and I use that word lightly, like yourselves, to some of the highest summits on the planet. And I'm going to take you through some of those processes. And the first thing I think we need to look at internally within organizations is how we measure performance and how the measurements we use actually prevent or drive unethical behavior. Very topical, of course, right now, SAA, receiving yet another 21 billion rand bailout. And I'm hoping that didn't come from the 500 billion that was meant to bail out the rest of South Africa during COVID. But how, where did that start? Dudu Mnyeni's now been found to be an incompetent director. But did it start with her? Does it end with her? And I think if you look at the SAA example, it started actually way back in the early 90s with a guy named Coleman Andrews, who took over leadership at SAA. And really was measured on results that were good for him, but not necessarily good for the airline. And one of the first things that Coleman Andrews did was he stripped SAA of many of its assets. The aeroplanes that it owned outright or that it had bought, those all went onto lease agreements. And whilst that at the end of his tenure looked very good on a P&L, it didn't bode very well for the future of SAA, particularly in terms of getting loans and that sort of thing. So it keeps relying on government bailouts. And of course, that is then exasperated by the fact that it has just been completely mismanaged. So how do we look at managing results? So think about if you've ever set goals for yourself. And I can guarantee you every single one of you has. And I now want you to look at the ratio between the goals that you've set and the ones that you've actually achieved. Those being outcomes. I remember very early on in my business career, attended one of these motivational speaking seminars. And the speaker said, you need to manifest. So do you write or do a vision board or write something down? And I'm sorry, I'm seeing a couple of folks are saying I'm a little bit soft. I'm just going to up the volume on my side. Is that better, folks? So do a vision board or write a manifestation. And so in those days, I thought it would be really cool if I drove a brand new Audi A4. And I got a photograph of it and I put it up in the office where the whole team worked. And I said, right, guys, if you work hard, I could buy one of those. And of course, it just didn't happen that way at all. So this photograph is taken so I'm just looking at those comments around the volume. Is that better? I'm going to Just move this microphone up a little bit as well. Okay, so this photograph taken just below the summit of a mountain called Aconcagua. It's the second highest of the 7 summits, and it's at around 7,000 meters. So most people look at that photograph and say the first time they said to me, Erik, you look really wasted. And the honest truth is, yes, I was pretty wasted. As I posted that photo to the group that I was leading at the time, one of the guys said, oh, look, that's me throwing up in the background. And if you look very carefully, you can see him leaning up against a rock throwing up. But one of the key things we do when we go on these expeditions is that we don't sell summits. And the funny thing about that is, even though getting to the peak of a mountain isn't the goal that we set for the team or for ourselves, we find that we have a far higher success rate than the average expeditions. So Aconcagua has a success rate of around about 25 to 30%. A reason for that is, apart from the altitude, it's, as I said, the second highest of the 7 summits. It's the highest peak outside of the Himalayas. But part of the low success rate is that it is a 3-week expedition. It takes you literally 20 days to get to the summit and a day to get down from the summit. So you're dealing with a lot of cold, a lot of discomfort, a lot of issues around altitude. But most importantly, there are lots of things in that process that we cannot control. The weather, what other teams are doing, the health of everybody. On this year's expeditions, I've led 5 expeditions at Aconcagua. I've summited 4 times. And this year, I didn't summit. 2 members of my team did. That was just over 50%. But so many things can happen, and it's around how you manage that. So the question then is, what kind of people do you get on that? And what we find is, when we shift the focus away from the summit as the victory condition, as I said, not only are we more successful, but we also find that people will set their own goals for the expedition. We've had some American clients come with us, and on the one expedition in 2016, the one guy went up to Camp 1 with us. He came back down. He said, look, that day for him was tougher than Kilimanjaro summit day, and he's done. He's experienced everything he wanted to do, and he's quite happy to pack up his bags and go home. And another friend who came with him said, well, I'll go home with Joe. The funny thing is, later in that year, these guys come back and do another mountain with us. So they leave not having felt that they have failed. Whereas if you go in there with the summit as the victory condition, you start creating problems. So in the early 2000s, I was brought on board a school's rugby team as their mental coach or mind coach. And one of the first things I asked them when we started this journey with them is, so basically their coach phoned me one Wednesday morning. He said, listen, Erik, I've come across you on the internet, and we've lost 5 games in a row. Can you come and do a motivational talk? And we've got to win our next game. I said, Mukubus, when's your next game? He said to me, on Saturday. And as I explained to him that that's not really how this stuff works. It's not a magic pill. He said, look, but please, can I do that? So I went through to, this is in Middelburg in Mpumalanga. I went through there on Friday morning on the way to the Kruger Park, and I did an hour with them. And the first question I asked them is, why do you play rugby? And they said, because we want to win. And I told them that that's exactly why they're not winning. So I started working with them, and we got a really nice process going of kind of weekly, every second week. Eventually I became so ingrained in the team. I was at every game, spoke to the guys at half time. And we get to the quarterfinal of the country's biggest schools rugby competition that year, called the Beelt Trophy at the time. And they're playing in the quarterfinal against this little school from Pretoria named Affies. And it's 27-6 at halftime to Affies. So around over 10,000 people arrived to watch the game that day. And at halftime, these oaks are leaving. You know, ons gaan nou braai. They're not really interested in this game anymore because it's so one-sided. I got to speak to the team at halftime, and I gave them one word. And they went back out in the second half. Full-time score, 33-all. Because it's a quarterfinal and there has to be a winner, they then go into extra time. and Offies lose that game 38-33. And the Offies captain that year was a guy named Pierre Spies, who's very well known, of course, and went on to play Springbok rugby. And he wrote a book a couple of years later, and in that book, he actually writes about that quarterfinal game. And he says, you know what? We still do not know how we lost that game from leading 27-6 at halftime. And it goes on to one thing, which is around engagement versus disengagement. Not only that people are engaged with a business, a company, or a team, but how engaged are they with the goals that we set? And again, I want to highlight the fact that we've got to rethink what this victory condition is, what the goal is, and I'll show you what we do a little bit later on. But there are three critical rules for culture for employees. And one of the big successes on our expeditions is the culture that we create in the team. Now, very often, the folks would only meet each other 2 or 3 times before the trip. Maybe they won't meet each other at all because they come from different parts of the world. But we make sure we have certain things in place prior to an expedition that creates the correct expectations, that creates the correct culture. And that is how we build success. So the first rule is that people only know what they know, which really means that your employees coming to work at your company will bring their current behaviors with them, because all we really do in business is we rotate employees between competitors every couple of years. I'm working on a banking merger in Kenya at the moment, and the 2,500 employees, almost 3,000 employees involved in this merger, have all worked at all of their competitors. And so when you keep bringing these different behaviors into the team, you begin to erode that. On this year's Aconcagua expedition, we had a gentleman on our expedition who was trying to set a world record in being the first person of color to do the 7, or the fastest person of color to do the 7 summits. And he'd done Vincent in Antarctica with us in December. January came with us to Aconcagua. And a couple of days into the expedition, he wanted us to go faster. He wanted us to not follow our strategy. And I said to him, you know what, ultimately it's your choice whether you want to get a different guide and continue. We recommend against it because we know that the process that we've got is the optimal process. You want to take your time. You don't want to rush up a mountain because you want to prevent altitude sickness. He made the call to go with another guide, a faster ascent, more time at altitude. And when I went up to Camp 3, to Camp 2, he was on his way down, completely smashed, proper altitude sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema. He spent several days in hospital in South America after that, and it scuttled his entire record attempt. The other really interesting thing was the minute he left our team, the atmosphere in our team had changed. There was some friction initially between some of the guys because of a political discussion we had earlier on. And it just shows how important it is, how important one person is to a culture. The second thing is what we allow in our team, in our organization, or in our culture will continue. So most companies approach onboarding as a short training program, and they pay very little attention to the unwritten rules that relate to the way things really get done in the company. And so employees pick up those nuances. I worked with the executive team at a project management company a couple of years ago. And the new MD and the new HR director, I'd worked with the HR director previously, she brought me on board. And within a couple of months, having worked with the senior team, the MD and the financial director uncovered fraud, both impacting the company's payments to revenue services and some backhanded deals, etc. So the FD, who was who was kind of fully aware of all this and orchestrated a lot of it, was fired. They got a new FD on board, and about 3 weeks after the new FD started, I did another session with this executive team, and we conducted an exercise called the prisoner's dilemma, which I'm not going to go into now, but go Google it. It's basically a game theory exercise, where essentially the story is 2 prisoners have been arrested, two criminals have been arrested on the suspicion of a crime. they're being questioned separately. If the one rats out the other one, he goes free, the other one gets 5 years. If they both rat each other out, they both get 3 years. But if they both remain silent, sorry, if they both rat each other out, yes, they get 5 years. If one rats the other one out, the other one gets 3 years. But if they both remain silent, there's no real charge against them. So they will only get 1 year on the charge of loitering. What do you do? And I split the management team into two, and I asked them to discuss that, come back and write the answer in an envelope. And both of these criminals decided to remain silent. And when we run this little exercise all over the world, the majority of people say that they will remain silent. I asked the team, why do you choose to remain silent? And the new FD, who'd been exposed to the culture for a couple of weeks, his exact words to us were, because there's honor amongst thieves. And it's so telling how important these kind of things are. And the third critical rule is that people will do and choose things by observing others. So the new FD comes on board, knowing full well the history that he's got to try and fix. But you can see the behavior around it. When we're on mountains, we see the behavior of people in other expeditions. Literally 5 days after doing Aconcagua this year, I led a team at Kilimanjaro. And it's a far busier mountain, and there are varying strategies there. We've got a 7-day strategy on Kili because, I'd rather go slow and get people to the summit than rush up it. But the majority of people go there on a 5-day strategy because that's easy to sell for a tour operator. You're away from home for a week, Sunday to Sunday. But it's not the optimal strategy. Some people try to do it in 3 days, which means your body doesn't have the opportunity to acclimatize. And so my team sits there and they go, yeah, but all these other people are going faster and they're doing more. And I say, yeah, but look closely at them. Look what they look like. Let's have a look at how many of them summit. What do they look like on summit day? And there's a marked difference. And it's all around this whole idea of understanding that altitude can kill you. So what happens to your body when you ascend? Firstly, your body recognizes the fact that the partial pressure of oxygen becomes less and less as you ascend. And what that does is it creates an imbalance in your body to allow your body to release a hormone called EPO, erythropoietin. Yes, the stuff that cyclists inject in themselves. But this happens naturally in your body. The thing is, the rate at which people acclimatize varies. And while everyone has the ability to acclimatize, we all acclimatize at different rates. So I'd rather take a conservative approach and give everybody the chance to do that. Because as you get higher and you start becoming hypoxic, which is part of the acclimatization process, the first thing that you actually lose is your ability to rationally make decisions. So this is why big mountains kill people, because the higher they get, the more they'll kind of lose their faculties if they're not ascending at a slow enough rate. And you start making crazy decisions. So when summit is the goal, how does that impact your judgment? When people in your organization have profitability or financial targets as goals, how does that impact on their decision making? I'm finding it a fascinating series that I found on Netflix called Dirty Money. 2 seasons, about 6 or 7 episodes per season. And it really is around, reporting on these massive global frauds, pharmaceutical companies, banks, etc. And while there's a little bit of sort of conspiracy theory that creeps in every now and then, a lot of it has to do with how companies behave. And when executives particularly have their remuneration, their reward attached to purely financial targets, which, let's be honest, most companies do, how does that impact their decision making? The fact is, altitude can and will kill you if you don't respect it. 1 year on, just after summiting Aconcagua, my one crampon kept coming off my shoe. And after the 4th time of stopping to tie it again, I just thought, stuff it. I took them both off, stuck them in my backpack. And a couple of minutes later, I slid down an icy slope, mean, it could have been 10 meters, it could have been 30 meters, I don't know, ramping over rocks. I could have broken a leg. And when you break something at just below 7,000 meters, you're in big trouble. But the fact is, one small decision, because I wasn't feeling great, I was hypoxic, altitudes, summits are never really fun. But you make a small thing, and it could have a massive impact. So the question then is, what stuff in your business may be a problem, but you're not recognizing it because you're too focused on a goal that could be irrelevant? So what is it specifically that we do? Is we shift the victory condition. We ask our clients to find purpose in the process. And that's what I invite companies that I work with to do as well, is to find purpose in the process of doing business. Not creating victory conditions that are dependent on end results or end games. Because when you're simply focusing on the summit as the victory condition, you will make decisions that are not good for you. If you've seen the movie Everest, you may remember you've got Mike Hall, very experienced climber, leading one of his clients, who's a postal worker from the US. And the guy says to him, Mike, this is the 3rd year we've been here. Same place at 2 o'clock, and you're turning me around, because the rule on Everest is if you haven't summited at 2 p.m., you turn around, you go back. What they didn't know and could never have known was the storm that was approaching, because in the mid-90s, 1996, when that happened, we didn't have the weather forecast technology that we have today. But Mike breaks a rule, and they both die. And so people get into this trap of defining their existence and who they are through the goals that they achieve, rather than the processes that they follow in order to achieve those goals. We used to do these monthly talks called Tuesday Talks, my partner in Explore, Alex Harris, and myself. And a couple of years ago, you may remember, also very well publicized, the rally driver Gugu Zulu and passing away on Kilimanjaro. And people are saying, what, people die on Kili? Well, yes, people die on Kilimanjaro all the time. Because of that, as I said, aggressive ascent strategy. And Gugu's passing was just kind of the combination of a perfect storm. While he was, and I never met him, but I've done a lot of work with his widow, Letsejo. So she tells me that Gugu was a fantastic guy, which everybody echoes. But when people asked Alex and myself at those talks, how can you die on Kili? We kind of speculated that it was an aggressive ascent strategy, a junior team doctor, and this whole idea of, I'm not feeling great, because no one really does feel great on a mountain, but that little bit of ego that goes into it as well, because Letsejo tells me she felt very strong on Kili, and she was going really well. And Gugs went there with flu. He wasn't in perfect health. And by not being honest, by having the victory condition of saying, you've got a summit, that's what ends up causing more harm than good. How are we setting goals in the businesses that we manage for our staff, for our executives? Are they process-based, or are they simply focusing on the summit as the victory condition? Because we have to change that. That's why accounting fraud happens. That's why backhand deals happen, because we're so set on achieving a pinnacle, a reward, a goal that is an outcome rather than based on a process. How would we make decisions differently if we were rewarded for the decisions that we made? How would we think differently in our organizations if we were rewarded and recognized not simply for a financial outcome, but for developing a process that allows us to be more sustainable over a longer period of time? And so what that really then comes down to is how we balance this whole idea of values, which are filters for decision-making, achievement, which are the conscious and subconscious goals that we set for ourselves, and understanding that in order to achieve those high standards of success, we propel ourselves forward towards those goals through the processes that we need to follow in order to achieve them, through the things that we consistently do at every level of the organization, the behaviors that we exhibit. And a lot of my time is spent helping companies create cultures based on those behaviors. So if we look at culture and dynamics, the team culture on our expeditions, the team culture right now in organizations is absolutely critical. I don't believe COVID has really caused any major disruption in the way we work. What it has done is it has sped up the rate of disruption. We were going to be moving to a more online-based work stream. We were going to be decentralizing our workforce. Anyway, the technology has been there for several years, but we've been hesitant to do that as businesses because it's so easy to be in a comfort zone. When we're comfortable, we feel safe. There's no real need to try something different. There's no real need to get people to work from home, to sit on online Zoom calls like we're all doing now. And so a study was done in the UK around COVID and this whole idea of transitioning to remote work. And what the study found is, to the question of, do you think transition to work from home may benefit your productivity in the long run? 76% of respondents said yes, it would. In other words, they believe they would be more productive than they currently have been. But it does mean that our culture needs to shift ever so slightly. It also means that really strong cultures will thrive. And if there are any chinks in your culture, that is going to cause you to not do so well. So one of those issues is around communication. And on our mountain expeditions, what we do is we have, everyone gets a training program, we do some group training sessions if possible, and then using technology, we either get people all in the same room for 2 or 3 face-to-face or Zoom-to-Zoom training sessions before an expedition, where we talk about the medical aspects, we talk about acclimatization, we talk about gear. We've, for the last couple of years, created these little WhatsApp groups. And the amazing thing is, like 4 years later, our 2016 Aconcagua group is still going, and people are still talking about stuff and sharing stuff on there. Now, what the research in the UK found around culture and remote work is that 73% of companies hold daily stand-up calls. In other words, the old Richard Branson analogy of, we don't sit down in a boardroom for meetings with coffee and snacks. We stand upright, and because if you can't tell me what you need to tell me in 4 or 5 minutes, you need to do it differently. You need to do a better job. We've also found through this research that companies are doing more and more low-cost culture-building initiatives. So, you know, Zoom sundowners, Zoom drinks, not work-related morning check-ins, movie nights using Netflix, you know, where everyone's watching the same movie, but we started at the same time, we're connected on a WhatsApp group for our team, for whoever. Group meditation and yoga fitness sessions that are all happening on Zoom. There's a ton of these kind of things. And what we find is that the way we can now reward and recognize people as well is changing, because we can use technology to create that culture and the dynamics through, you know, Uber Eats deliveries for pizza. Interesting, 72% of respondents in terms of culture and remote working said that trust is an essential component for transitioning to a successful work from home culture. And so what we find is that teams who have treats or perks delivered to them have increased to 60%. And the work from home initiatives that have had the worst take-up or generated the worst feeling within the culture of the team is daily whole team calls. And there are managers who still want to try and micromanage. So we set up these calls, we spend hours on Zoom because we think we need to be doing it the same way we've done it in the office. You know, those managers who manage by walking around are still trying to do that. And we need to move away from that. And so those are some of the things. And the research is showing that, as I say, you know, the culture is absolutely imperative. Particularly with this kind of work from home environment that we're moving into. So what are the 4 things that people need and want in a team culture, whether it be remote or whether it be traditional. And the first thing that people need is perceived control. People need to have the perception that they are in control of what they do, when they do it, how they do it. And so on our expeditions, a lot of what we do is consultative. You know, on our desert trek, for example, where we trek 180 kilometers across the Leeward Crescent in the Middle East, we give the guys a satellite photo every morning with a little pin of where we are, and we say to them, this is where you need to be tonight, plot your own route. And the object there is to link these salt flats called subcoasts together, because you'd rather be walking on those than climbing up and down soft sand dunes. But when we give people that perceived control, we find they're more engaged. The same in decision-making on mountains. Guys, this is our program. How are we all feeling? Are we happy to proceed to Camp 1 today? So on this year's Aconcagua expedition, I picked up a bit of a bug on our rest day before summit bid, and the doctors advised me to not go to Camp 1 the following day. The team, however, went up, and on the day after, when they went to Camp 2, I ascended from Camp 1 to Camp 2, and I met them there. And the same kind of thing happens with that we sometimes do with clients as well, particularly on safe mountains, where you're not liable to fall off anywhere or anything like that. The second thing that's so important that people want in a team culture is perceived progress. People want to feel that the effort that they put in is leading to something significant. And it's that focus on process again, is because people want to see, where are we going? How are we going to get there? Is our process working? Can we trust the process? And so on our expeditions, we give everybody an expedition manual, where we basically say to them, this is our timeline, this is what we're going to be doing every day, and they can follow it in there. And we can make changes as we go. The third one is connectedness. And I think the whole social media way that has exploded over the last 10 years is because of exactly that. I mean, let's be honest. You're mates on Facebook with the person you most hated in high school, or who bullied you in high school. And the only reason you connected with them is not because you want to be friends now, but you want to see how terrible their life actually is, or how they've turned out, which is why we just keep putting all the braggy stuff on. But we want to feel that we're connected, not just to the people who work with us, but also connected to progress, connected to control, and connected to the fourth thing, which is vision or meaning. In other words, what is the meaning that I'm creating in what I'm doing? Not just for myself, but for my community. And I don't necessarily mean this has to be philanthropic ventures. It means that what is the purpose of my business? And so a lot of companies are now starting to employ that whole purpose-based thinking around Simon Sinek's Golden Circle model. But really what it all comes down to is the filters that we use to make the decisions that we make, because those are what values really are. And unfortunately, many companies are looking at values as a way of reframing their goals and putting that on the wall in reception. One of the banks in South Africa has one of their top line values that are printed on beautiful posters and stuck up everywhere, including the guardhouse at their leadership center. And the number one value is delivering shareholder value. Now, what relevance does that possibly have to the person in the guardhouse? Absolutely none, right? And if you're quite honest about it, saying one of our values is to deliver shareholder value, how does that really influence our decisions? In a good way or in a bad way? Are we possibly going to be making unethical decisions based on that value? Because if you look at, Enron, whose leaders went to jail and which went bankrupt from fraud, had the values of integrity, communication, respect, and excellence stuck on their wall. But none of this was happening inside the organization, but it looked really good on the wall. When values become too complicated, we go to the lengths that this is Prime Media in Johannesburg, where we do value cushions and we put them on the sofa in reception. So it means our visitors can now put their bums on our values. But it just becomes too difficult, too complex. Another example of a company that's getting this right is one we've all gotten to know really well in the last couple of weeks, Netflix. And, so instead of putting the nice sounding things on their wall and as their values in their organization, they've taken the approach that actual company values, as opposed to the nice sounding ones, are shown by who gets rewarded, promoted, or let go. If we really have, I'm going to go back one, a value of integrity, it means that people who don't uphold that, who fiddle with anything from as insignificant as timesheets or missing meetings or not living up to your commitments, should be punished for that. But that never happens. And so what happens, so Netflix has gone and looked at only 3 values, and one is innovation, and they've created an amazing and engaging subtext around it. Saying, so what does innovation mean? It means you reconceptualize issues to discover practical solutions to hard problems. So that not only has an application physically in the technology that they use and the viewer experience that they create, it also has an impact on their day-to-day function. And how do I deal with conflict, for example? When I reconceptualize issues in a conflict situation, it allows me to be less pushy, less in your face, less obtrusive about that conflict. They talk about honesty. It says you're known for candor and direction and directness. So honesty very often is just seen as, being honest, not necessarily in being forthright and open, having candor. You're non-political when you disagree with others. I love that, because particularly in a South African environment, who's looking at values such as honesty, integrity, around being non-political about it? Passion is one we see often. And if you look at the root, the Latin root of the word passion, remember the movie The Passion of the Christ? So passion in its original Latin form means to suffer for. So, you ask anybody in your organization who's passionate about working here, everyone's going to put up their hand, right? Because their job depends on it. But when you go back to its actual meaning, the word passion, meaning to suffer for, and you ask people in your organization, right, who's willing to suffer for this team, you're probably going to get a very, very different response. So how can what questions can we ask to guide our thinking about the values that we have in our business? And I've put a couple up here. So saying what is really important to us, what's brought us together and continues to hold us together. What will help guide us when we're facing a difficult decision? Do we take the shortcut to get our profits back up where they should be because of what's happened at COVID, or do we? What are the things you like about what we do at your business, and how do we do it? And what parts of our company are you really proud of? Some more questions to then, once you've got those initial ones, is to refine it, is to say, so is this something we'll still believe in 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And, very often I think values become the flavor of the moment. What should we have on the wall? What sounds good now? But is it something that will still be relevant 5 years from now? Is this something we're willing to hire on? A company called Zappos, there was an online shoe sales portal. They were bought by Amazon a couple of years ago for just over $1 billion. And Tony Hsieh, who was CEO of that company, created a couple of things within an organization around values. And one of the things that they did at Zappos was, if you started working there, no matter what your position was in the business, you spent your first month in the call center, because that's the heartbeat of everything that they do. But they went one step further and said to people, if you leave within your first 3 months, if you choose to leave, for whatever reason, we're not interested in that, we will still pay you 3 months of salary. What that meant is that people only stayed at Zappos if they truly believed in the culture, if they were truly happy working there. They never felt that they were stuck here, because if I quit now, I've still got to pay my bond, I've still got to feed my family, so I don't like it here, I don't fit in, but I'll stay anyway for the money. And I think that's a lot of what's really happening in many business cultures in South Africa today. People are so hard up for jobs, they'll work anywhere and do almost anything, irrespective of whether there's a good cultural fit. Is it something we'll hire on? Is it something to do with fire on? Or is it something we can apply to customer relations or internal development or product development? And so we need to create values that are applicable in our decision making throughout the organization. So I want to share with you then, just almost in closing, 3 values that we created for a banking merger in Nigeria. And this was a major bank merging with an asset management firm. And the 3 values that we created for this organization through a very consultative process and applying some of the filters that I've suggested. The first value is in sync. And so we say we are in sync, working united as one firm. We raised our collective game, becoming an inspiring and trusted partner to clients. We are empowered. We're free to challenge convention by constantly raising the bar, contributing towards intelligent and insightful solutions. And in everything that we do, in every decision we make sure that we are impactful. Doing the right thing, even when no one's looking, every day, adding value to our colleagues, our clients, and our society. And so the last thing I'd like to share with you then is how, in the past we've heard about storming, norming, forming in teams and cultures, but I want to look at something called the partnership model. And I want you to think back when you first started at the current company that you're working, or apply it to a personal relationship. Those first couple of months dating your significant other. And the first feeling we could probably describe as glee. You know what, in those first couple of months, he or she could do no wrong. The first couple of months at the organization that you work at, they could do no wrong. This was the best place I've ever worked. But over time, you realize that along with the glee, there's also a fee. Because, as much as I love her, eventually the conversation goes to, babe, why can't you, like a normal person, squeeze the toothpaste from the bottom of the tube? And the bedroom floor is not a washing basket. Dirty clothes should go. And so the longer we spend at it with someone, we realize that there's some fees. The longer we work in an organization, we realize that there are some fees to pay. Geez, I'm working a lot of overtime. And then when the fees begin to outweigh the glee, what do we hear people start saying? We start hearing them talk about me. I'm not getting enough of this. I'm not getting enough recognition. Babe, you never tell me you love me anymore. And I say to her, well, I told you 6 months ago, and I'll tell you if anything changes. Now, when a relationship, whether it be personal or business, gets to me, and again, think of the story I told you about our Aconcagua expedition this year, where one climber was chasing something, a record, didn't fully understand how the process of, you've got to summit Aconcagua, otherwise your whole record is smashed. But when it comes to me, I need to move faster. I need to spend more time at altitude. I need to. One of 2 things happen. The easiest thing to do is to flee. That's it, I'm out here. I'm finding another guide. That's it, I'm resigning. I'm going to work somewhere else. That's it, we're getting divorced. I'm out of here. But why do people stay together? Why do people stay at organizations? And the only reason people stay is because at some level they can see what is possible through we. And when we create that environment, through the filters we have for decision making, the values that we do, the behaviors that we hold dear, that we recognize and reward, that's when we start building what I call an ethical business, a company that can use this whole concept of being focused on a process, not necessarily on a goal, to create sustainable value. And that's why I call this organization, this presentation, Ridgeline Thinking, and how we can look at values and behaviors to build an ethical organization. So folks, that is basically my story. And we're going to open the floor now to some questions. I see there has some questions have come up. And the first question is from Dancia Richards. She says, this is why one's values should become your convictions rather than empty words. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely echo that. Paco says, please demystify the partnership value model further. So Vicky, I know we have tried in the past to open microphones and for soundbite questions. Paco, could you maybe just unmute yourself and just expand on that question that you're asking?
Paco, you need to raise your hand and then I'll be able to see it, and I'll have to unmute you first.
Okay, the hand is up.
Here we go. Allow to talk, and here we go.
Good morning, Paco. Tell me, how would you like me to demystify the partnership model?
Please unmute
Paco,
your
just click unmute on your, yes, there we go.
Is it fine? Is it
Morning.
fine now?
Yes.
Yes, 100%.
Morning. Yes, I don't understand the elements of me as they follow. Glee, fee, me, flee, and see. How do you relate it to the organization?
Right,
How do you relate?
Okay, so anyone who comes to work at your company, within your organization, initially, you know, they've had some reason for applying to work there. And they go through the selection process and we hire them, and they are happy to work there. They will defend the organization because they've got to, from a psychological perspective, defend their own decision for going to work there. So they'll look for all the good in the organization. But then they'll realize that there are some not so good things. There are some fees that you have to pay in order to work at your business. It might be the hours they spend in traffic. It might be overtime. It might be that they then realize that their remuneration isn't quite as high as they thought it might be, or it's not quite as high as your competitors. And so over time, and also speaking to everyone within the organization, you know, the water cooler chats, they realize that, you know, it's not just all glee here. And we then start focusing on the fees. And when the unhappy elements, the fees, begin to outweigh the glee, then I start focusing on me and what I'm not getting enough of and what I'm getting too much of that makes me unhappy. When it gets to me, I have a choice. I can either flee to go and work somewhere else, or I can resign, but I stay on the payroll, which is what a lot of people are doing. They become disengaged. You might remember that table I shared early on in the presentation. Or they can stay because they can see what's possible when we work together based on the culture that we create. Does that answer your question?
That's fine. It's fine. Thanks.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Paco. So let's have a look. 9:46. Why do employees who are unhappy with the ethics, etc., of the company they work for stay? Is it fear? I think, yes, it's fear of not having an income. It's fear of not finding another job. It's fear of knowing that I have to care for myself, my family. But a lot of it also has to do with fear of the unknown. And while there might be a lot of things that I don't agree with within the organization, as an individual, I'm still in a comfort zone. I'm getting a monthly salary. It covers the basics. And so we need to start looking at, are people staying because they want to stay, or are people staying because they have nowhere to go? And where I'm doing a lot of work, obviously, is in terms of mergers and building new cultures within merged organizations. We find that often people in mergers feel uncertain, unsure, am I going to keep my job? But we then see that companies are making them promises that, you know, we won't lay people off, or regulatory permissions are based on the fact that there can't be layoffs within a certain period of time and that sort of thing. But people stay because they often feel that they've got nowhere else to go. And, you know, sometimes the devil that you know is better than the devil that you don't know. What we've got to do, though, is create a culture where people stay because they want to be there, because they want to brag about the results of the organization. They want to brag about being able to contribute to what the purpose of your organization. Sharon, thank you for the insights. Comment further on how we make sure we don't leave behind the lower levels in our organization in terms of remote working. You spoke of applicability to someone in the guardroom, for example. So I think it has to do with those 4 aspects of engagement that I shared. I'll go back there for you. And it has to do with that, you know, particularly the blue collar workers, the lower levels. You know, how many of us in organizations have actually actively reached out to our blue collar workers over this period of lockdown, for example, where they are stuck at home? They might be non-essential workers. Have we reached out to them? Have we created an engagement platform for them as well, bearing in mind that they only have mobile phones, limited connectivity, etc.? I mean, with the client in Kenya at the moment, we found an app actually that allows you to do team quizzes. So they've had these team quizzes on Friday nights within certain teams. It is not Zoom dependent or anything. It's a very low data application on a phone. It doesn't have to be a top-end smartphone. And, you know, so it's around how do we, for our blue-collar workers, get them to understand perceived control, that what they do allows us to progress, that they are really connected to the organization, and so on. Samsung Galaxy 7 Edge asks, what's the second culture rule for employees? There it is. It's what you allow will continue. Offense, at the beginning of the session, you mentioned that new people bring new and own thinking and which erodes that which we have in the organization. How do we as the organization deal with those without evoking the flea, but rather see and we? It is a very complex issue, and it has a lot to do with how visible your culture is in terms of behaviors, how well it's communicated, how consistent we are in applying it, and how do we create, I almost want to call it a second level of communication, where your first level is the overt stuff that we design and we deliberately communicate during an onboarding process. But what's the second level? Also, how can we as an organization look at really communicating our culture before people start working for us? You know, I look at a lot of company websites, and most companies hold that very close to their chest. We don't brag about our culture. And maybe it's time we start doing that. Maybe it's time we hire based on cultural fit, not only on CV and qualifications fit. Zora, sorry I missed, what did you say the Middleburg rugby side at halftime? So the halftime score was 27-6. They were behind against Uffie's full-time score 33-all. Now I know the question I often get in live presentations is, Erik, what was that word that I gave them at halftime? And the word is Paganini, which means nothing to most people unless you're a classical music aficionado. And Paganini was a world-class violinist at the turn of the 20th century. And in his last concert that he played before he retired, as he was playing, at the end of the first movement, one of the strings on his violin snapped. And the conductor looked at him very panicked and said, "What do we do now?" And Paganini mouthed back at him. He says, "Oh, we play." And so they played. And then a second string broke. And eventually a third string broke. And I mean, a violin only has 4 strings. But every time, Paganini just said to the conductor, "We play, we continue with the process." And when it was done, the audience stood up as one and shouted encore and applauded. And I told the story to the team as part of the process that I have when working with teams like that several weeks earlier. And so the thing is, in that match situation where they were behind the 8 ball and they were being outplayed, instead of going back to the process that they know, instead of sticking with what they've trained, we always try and do something new. And if one player in a team starts doing something new, no one else knows what that is, and everyone else ends up on the back foot. And so I told them that story to just remind them that we need to trust in what we know what we've practiced, what our process is, and we will get the result that we did, or that we want. And they got that result. How can a CEO best inform or pursue a board of directors that altitude can kill you and avert the fixation with the numbers? Unfortunately, people often think that a focus on softer value issues means a compromise in performance, and they resist the issues of culture and values. Again, that's not an easy answer, and forgive me if I step on any toes now, but I think part of how we've arrived at that problem is of who we put in senior positions. And we find so often that people with strong financial backgrounds end up in senior management positions, CEO positions. And we've got to understand that obviously the bottom line is important. Otherwise, we don't stay in business. Obviously, that's important to shareholders because they want to see that kind of return on the shares that they hold. But more and more, we have to get HR a bigger seat on the executive team. We have to give them a bigger seat on the board. We have to get a deeper understanding that of financial return is the result of a great culture. And it's not either or, and having a lot of focus on culture and what we call those soft issues needn't be done at the sacrifice of the bottom line. In fact, research study after research study shows how important that is. When I worked with the mobile phone company in Kenya called Safaricom, in their transition from their previous CEO to, or their CEO to the new CEO when Michael Joseph retired, we did a whole culture intervention with them. And what we actually found was that staff turnover decreased, wastage or expenditure decreased, customer loyalty increased, simply because there were subtle changes in the behavior of the people within the organization. And everybody can feel that. Suppliers, customers, management, colleagues can feel that. And so simply looking at a cultural intervention, we created a very impactful bottom line change. I agree with you that hiring should have a lot of bearing on soft skills, say issues on emotional intelligence. Absolutely, Paco. Michelle, what are some practical ways to encourage people to adopt values-related desired behaviors? And do you think that these soft elements are better positioned as a reward system that is separate to KPIs, or rather as hard KPIs? So they should be as important as hard KPIs. Because again, we've got to get people to understand that my behavior, what I consistently do, is the process that allows me to achieve the hard KPIs. We also need to look at how we reward people. And there are two types of reward. And I call them market currency and emotional currency. And most people are rewarded with market currency. You know, here's a pick and pay voucher. Here's a bonus. Oh, my team worked late last Thursday so we can meet a pressing deadline. Here's a $200 voucher. Now, if I got my team to work 2 hours late and I gave them a $200 voucher, that's very easy to equate. Oh, yes, okay, to my manager, my overtime is worth $100 an hour in pick and pay vouchers, over and above everything else. Which means that in 2 months' time, when I ask my team to do that again, and they work 3 hours overtime, and I don't give them a $300 voucher, now they feel miffed. What I should rather do is look at how we create emotional currency. In other words, reward people with experiences or things that do not have an overt financial or market value. You know, something like dinner with their favorite sports star. Things like that, things that you cannot attach a value to. And while that becomes difficult because I have to really get to know the people who work with me or the people who work in my organization or in my team, the loyalty that creates, the see what we can achieve through we becomes far more powerful with emotional currency than with financial currency. I think we've covered all the questions, Vicky.
Yes, there's one raised hand by Sathi Govender, so I'm going to allow him to speak and then we'll end our session, I think, there. So if you can please unmute yourself and you can then talk. If anybody else would like to ask a question, they can also raise their hand now.
David Stadler's got his hand up as well.
Sathi, if you can please unmute your mic. No, it's not working. Okay, I'm going to, I see Abraham Muller also wants to speak, so I'm going to give you a chance. You can please unmute your mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, Abraham, loud and clear.
Can I just ask you, how would you deal with the situation which actually has manifested itself in real life, where in senior management positions you get people who display narcissistic tendencies, but in the wider work environment are perceived to be incredibly sweet persons, but in the immediate work relationship they drive you to the limit where you probably will have to leave the organization. How does one deal with a situation like that?
I think that's never easy, because I think that whole idea of ego-driven or narcissistic management behavior is driven very often by the media. No one really hears about CEOs that are doing amazing work unless they're kind of in the media or in the front page. I think the way to deal with that within an organization is we've got to make people aware of the effect that their behavior has on the people that work with them, whether it's at board level, whether it's at management level, whether it's at employee level. And then look at how we, again, create a process of rewards driven by what we want to see in that relationship, what we want to see from that executive, rather than the ego, the bottom line. It's not an easy fix. It never will be, because I think it's something that's been created, not by our own organizations, but by the business world in general over the last couple of years. But Ibrahim, I think in short, let's see how we can get these guys to understand the impact that their narcissistic behavior has on the people who work with them. And it requires a lot of insight into really soft skills. Yeah.
Thank you, Abraham. Okay, I'm going to try one more time. Sathi, can you unmute your mic? In the meantime, I see Paco also has another question. So Paco, if you want to unmute, you can also ask.
Okay, it's just a comment to thank Erik for his topic. It is very, very useful. A lot of value has been destroyed by some employers who just sack employees without observing some of this with a view to remedying, taking remedial measures. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Paco.
It's a great pleasure, Paco.
Okay, great. Erik, I think Sathi is having issues unmuting, so there's no further questions in the Q&A. I'd like to give you a big thank you for today's session. As we can see from the comments, I think everybody did enjoy it and really saw some value today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please do complete our survey questionnaire at the end once the Zoom meeting ends, or using the QR code that you see on your screen. We will see you all again next week. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, thanks.